I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands upon which Macquarie University is situated, the Wallamatical people of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the dream time. So the purpose of today is to give an overview of student participation in different types of WIL and the impact of WIL on graduate outcomes. And I'll just share a few little housekeeping updates before we get started. The event will go on for about an hour. Actually, I should say exactly an hour. So time is quite limited, and the presentation will be followed by a Q&A. So if you have questions as we go along, please do post them to the chat. The event is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the website. And at some points, at different points during the proceedings, we'll plan to take a few screenshots for LinkedIn. If you have any concerns about that, please do just mute your camera. And at this point, it is my great pleasure to introduce our presenters for today. So we have with us Professor Denise Jackson. She is the director of WIL. She pretty much needs no introduction in this space, but I will introduce her anyway. She is the director of WIL in the School of Business and Law at Edith Cowan University. Her work focuses on enhancing student employability and career prospects. She is a principal fellow of Advanced Higher Education, or Advanced HE. She is past president of ACEN, and her work has been recognized with 2 national teaching awards. And we also have with us Dr. Elizabeth Cook. She is a research associate in the Nutrition and Health Innovation Research Institute at ECU as well. She is also journal manager for the Journal of Teaching and Learning for Graduate Employability. And at this point, it is my pleasure to hand over to Denise.
Great, thanks, Jen. And it's morning here in Perth, so morning or afternoon to you all, and thanks for joining us today. We've got quite a lot of results to go through, and apologies really for the lateness of this webinar. As you probably know, there was a bit of a delay in getting the GOS data this year, so that's why our first webinar is being held now rather than usually we tend to hold one in around May-June time. So there's an overview of what we're covering in the webinar, and myself and Elizabeth will speak to different parts. I'll talk for a moment about the items, which I think most of you are probably familiar with, and also student participation in WIL. When I say student participation, as we know, the Graduate Outcomes Survey, it's graduates reflecting back and recalling their WIL experiences, but no doubt we'll refer to them as students during the presentation. And we'll look at participation in those 3 different areas, and then we will speak to the impact of WIL. And we now have 4 years worth of data. Some of the data will be time series by year, and some of it will be where the data will be aggregated across the 4 years, and that will be, obviously shown in the slides. And you've got 3 different areas of impact. Q&A, as Jen said, throw your questions into the chat. Any questions around the logistics and admin of the items, they're better off to go into an email to the central ACEN email. We can deal with those separately. In terms of the items themselves, so as we know, we've got 5 items over the last 4 years. You can see the number of universities that are participating there for the years that we'll be presenting. Those graduate samples include undergraduates and postgraduates. I'm putting in the first item, which is the different types of WIL, because often we have questions around, well, what do you mean by work-based WIL, and what do you mean by WIL not based in the workplace? So that is actually the question that the graduates will see when they complete their GOS 4 to 6 months post-course completion. So 3 different types. Yes, we know that's quite subjective. Classifying WIL is, not easy in any scenario. So we are mindful of that, and obviously we need to keep that in mind when we interpret the data as well. Okay, so moving on, I'm first actually going to present on the postgraduate participation. Quick snapshot here, and then the rest of the presentation will be bachelor focused. I know there's probably a demand for looking more in depth at postgraduates, which will service at a later time, particularly HDRs, because there's obviously been movement in that space around funding and we're seeing growth. So that is a focus for us going forward. So participation, postgrads, both international and domestic, just orienting you to the slide format because it's going to be the same all the way through. These are Tableau dashboard slides, which I'm sure some of you or most of you are familiar with. But you've got your different presentations for the types of wills. You've got any will, if they've done any form. You've got the 3 different types there, work-based, non-workplace and global. And then you've got no will. Remember, these aren't mutually exclusive, so they can do, they could do 2 types of will, for example. So they, they're not mutually exclusive across the 3 categories. In terms of the postgrads, just looking to the left at any will, you can see that there's been a slight rise in postgrad participation over the 4 years, which is positive. There's been a marginal rise in work-based will, a bigger rise in non-workplace will, the dark green there, and a marginal fall in global will. And you're going to see that really much all the way through the presentation. I don't think there's any big surprises there from COVID restrictions. And also, we haven't really reached our recovery in terms of global offerings, I would say. So while, yes, it's positive in a way, we've got growth, although it's marginal. When we take a step back, still only about half of our postgraduate coursework students are engaging in will. So that might be, and we need to look at our own institution stats to understand if that's an area for growth for ourselves. In terms of the HDRs, you can see a bigger growth pattern over the 4 years. No big surprises there with the changes in the funding for the research training program, which is really incentivizing internships. And that change that you can see on the left-hand side in any will is really driven by the growth in work-based will, which is your bluey color, your dark bluey color. There has been growth in non-workplace will. And actually, of all the categories of global will, this is where, well, there's been some marginal growth, whereas in the other coursework areas, you'll see a fall pretty much across the presentation. So again, it's positive, there's growth, but at the end of the day, in 2023, 3/4 of our HDRs are not engaging in will of any type. Moving on to bachelor graduates, which is the main focus of the presentation. So again, looking at domestic and international, and looking at all discipline areas. So, all of our graduate sample, well, undergraduate or bachelor graduate sample. So again, we've got the same setup with the slides here. And if we look at any will initially, you can see that there's been a slight rise in will across the 4 years. We're looking at around 4%. And this is driven really in 2 ways by work-based will. You can see a slight growth there at 2.6%. And we've got a bigger growth in non-workplace will, which is up there sitting at around 5%. Possibly we might have expected a bigger growth in work-based will across the disciplines, given the big focus on will in the sector. But, we must remember this is data from 2023. And also there is a lag. So this is 4 to 6 months post graduation for those students or post-course completion. Global will, as I said, you can see that drop there amongst bachelor graduates. And then if we look overall, again, take a step back, things are rising, that's great. There's more students engaging or proportionately more students engaging in will across the 4 years, but we're still sitting at around a 40% engagement rate, which again, we need to look at this in our own institutions, but we'd like to think that when we look at this data in 5 years' time, hopefully that percentage will be down in terms of students not engaging in any type of will. Breaking this down now, so this is bachelor graduates, international and domestic, across all the discipline areas, and we're breaking it down into categories, and we're looking at citizenship first. Just taking a look over on the left-hand side and looking at overall, you can see that in 2020, fairly similar proportions of domestic and international students were engaging in any type of will. Whereas if you look here at 2023, you can see that proportionally more international students are engaging in WIL than domestic counterparts. You've got a difference there of, just over 5%. So where has that come from? So you can see, if you look across the different types here, non-workplace WIL, you've got a 5% difference there in 2023. And in global WIL, you've got far fewer domestic students engaging in global WIL compared to their international counterparts. What is quite interesting is in terms of work-based WIL, the literature traditionally, and I speak to this as well when I've done studies around international students engaging in WIL, we tend to think that they participate proportionately less than domestic students. But we're seeing here that's actually, there's only very marginal difference there. There's almost parity, which is great, considering that we know that there are known barriers and challenges for international students engaging in work-based WIL. Moving on to Indigenous students. So here again, we can see in 2020, we've got quite similar proportions engaging in WIL for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. Whereas if we look at 2023, our Indigenous students are engaging proportionately less, it's around a 6% difference there. What's that driven by? We can see here in terms of the differences that's partially or actually largely driven by differences in work-based WIL. So here the gap, there's parity really in 2020, and there is around a 4% gap here in 2023. Although there is an upward trend in our Indigenous students, but no, sorry, for Indigenous students, there's a downward trend. For everyone else, it's an upward trend. In terms of non-workplace WIL, again, you've got some differences there, and you've got some differences in global WIL. So they're not too acute, but something to be mindful of and something for us to look at in our own institutions. Now moving to socioeconomic status, and just remembering that in the GOS, this is defined by residential postcode during study, which is a fairly blunt measure. So just, keeping that in mind. We have low, medium, and high, and my apologies for low being in the middle. It's a bit counterintuitive, I'm afraid. That's Tableau that produced that, and I will work out how to adjust that. But this is, the Tableau dashboard is new for us in ACEN, and it's been a great help, I must say. So breaking down SES and looking overall, first of all, on the left-hand side, you can see that there's a slightly higher rise in, if you look at our low SES students going from 56.6% to 62.4%, that rise is proportionally slightly greater than our medium and our high groups. Although the growth over the years, the gaps remain, fairly similar across the three groups there. There is an upward trend in work-based WIL. Again, though, the gap remains between low and high at around 5%. And it's probably the opposite to what we think. So you've actually got our low SES students in 2023, proportionately more are participating than high SES groups. However, remember that this is all disciplines, and it includes all of our students where WIL is mandatory. So, social work, nursing, teacher education, etc. We are going to separate out those disciplines, and I'll present that data to you in a moment. In terms of non-workplace WIL, pretty comparable. In terms of global WIL, you can see some differences there, although they are fairly marginal. Okay, moving on to students with disability. So overall, you can see here that students with disability participate relatively less, or fewer participate compared to students without disability. Again, you've got by 2023, you've got a difference there of around 4%. What's that driven by? It's driven, perhaps unsurprisingly, by work-based WIL. You can see the difference there of around 4.5%, 5%. And that's, very much aligned with what we read about in the literature. And there's been a, increasing focus on this, about the fact that there's relatively fewer students with disability engaging in work-based WIL compared to their their students and students without disability. Non-workplace will, you've got parity. Sorry, I must also note though here on a positive note that 2020 to 2023, there are proportionately more students with disability engaging in work-based will. That is important to note. So while the trend is upward, the gap is slightly bigger. Okay, so moving back, we've got parity here, and we have with global will, you've got proportionately less students with disability engaging in global will. And you've got that downward trajectory of global will participation, which I noted at the beginning of the presentation for anyone that's arrived slightly late. So what we've done here is we've taken out those areas where traditionally work-based will is mandatory. And we're left with 11 areas, which you will see here on the next slide on the left-hand side. Now, this isn't perfect because some of you might look at that and go, well, no, we have mandatory placements in some of our areas. This is, what we're working with. And if you look at our 3-year reviews that we did, that we published, those documents on participation, we're using the same 11 elective areas. So you can actually compare back to that as well if you wanted to. But so we're looking now, we're looking at work-based will for domestic and bachelor undergraduates in those areas and those areas only. The darker green is the proportion in that particular discipline group that engaged in work-based will, while the grey is those that didn't engage in work-based will, obviously. So that just gives you a bit of a snapshot. Now, you might be looking in tourism, hospitality, etc., thinking fantastic results. I must just flag to you that the sample is very small there. This is over the 4 years, and the sample is around 550 student or graduates, whereas in the others, the sample is in thousands. So I'm just, flagging that might have that might skew the data slightly. So in terms of here, I guess when you look at that, you can see, well, there's lots of range. You can see the areas that perhaps aren't performing as well. So you've got psychology, you've got humanities, culture and social sciences, and you've got the creative arts. So your more kind of generalist degrees, you've got around 1/3 or less than 1/3 are taking part. Whereas if you move here, you've got more towards the 50% mark, law and communications as well. So hopefully that might be of interest, and I would encourage you, to look at this at your own institutional level as well to see what's happening in those areas. In terms of non-workplace will, again, there's variability. So obviously the green is in those different discipline areas, the proportion of graduates that declared that they're engaging in non-workplace will. You can see here, creative arts, opposite to work-based will, there's proportionately more. There's quite a high proportion engaging in non-workplace will. And that might be, activities such as that they're doing on campus, like productions on campus and that type of thing. They're possibly engaging in more of that type of will than they would those actually going out into traditional internships. So, looking and thinking, okay, well, my discipline's really low here. It's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just depends on nuances by discipline type. Moving on to global will, and again, just flagging the proportions are small and the samples are smaller here, obviously. But again, you've got variability. So ranging from 2.7% in psychology, up to, I think the top one, 9% in agriculture and environmental studies. We have also included a slide here for those that have not engaged in any type of will during their university studies in these discipline areas. And again, just reminding you, these are bachelor graduates, international and domestic. So, the highest proportion would be in psychology, humanities, science and maths. So, I mean, this gives you a sector snapshot, but obviously it's really what's happening in our own institutions that's, more important to us. What we've done now is we've broken this down into by looking at the different groups. We have still doing it by time series, looking across the 4 years. So first of all, looking at citizenship. So this is aggregated across the 11 elective discipline areas. So it's all of them lumped in together by year. So some kind of high-level results, I suppose. As expected, proportionately fewer students are engaging in WIL overall than in areas where it's mandated. I mean, obviously, otherwise we've done something wrong with our groupings. For citizenship, interestingly, there's no wildly different results to those that I've showed in a previous slide, with all the disciplines included. Again, more internationals are participating, which is great to see as positive shift that we've seen over the years. Work-based WIL, the gap is narrowing, and it's now similar, so you can see here. So we've still got that trend of 30, there's slightly proportionately more internationals engaging in work-based WIL, even in areas where it's optional, which is probably different to what we would predict. Same for non-workplace WIL, and the difference is more acute there, and global, same, greater engagement. In terms of our Indigenous, the differences by in the Indigenous category, lots of variability here when you look at the overall area, and bigger gaps for WIL overall between Indigenous and non-Indigenous than in all the discipline groups. So essentially, if WIL is optional, there tends to be greater differences between those students that are Indigenous participating and those that are not Indigenous. So we can see here where those differences are being driven, and perhaps unsurprisingly, they're being driven in work-based WIL, whereas the gaps here for non-workplace and global WIL are very similar to those gaps that we saw in the patterns that we saw for all of the discipline groups. So, essentially, we can kind of conclude here that if WIL isn't mandated, the differences are more acute in the work-based WIL area, and that's what's driving the difference overall. Looking at socioeconomic status, so just remembering, casting our mind back to an earlier slide, we saw that proportionately more low ES were taking, SES students were taking part in work-based WIL and WIL overall, which is somewhat surprising to us. When we move to the elective areas, proportionately more medium and high SES students, graduates are engaging. So, when you see in the literature, often we hear about barriers to low SES students engaging in internships because of logistics, caring commitments, needing to engage in part-time work, etc. We can see that here. We couldn't see it before, but when you pull out the elective disciplines, you can see those differences there. They're not huge, but they are there. If you look, for example, in 2023, you've got 4 or 5% difference in participation between low and high SES students engaging in work-based WIL across those elective areas. Other points, nothing different to before in terms of the wider discipline areas. There's nothing different in terms of non-workplace and global WIL. Looking at students with disability, so as with the wider disciplines, there are proportionately fewer students engaging in work-based WIL, although the gap is less, which is quite interesting. So if WIL is mandated, and if it's electives, students with disability are still participating proportionately less. Perhaps that might raise a question about, in those areas where it's mandatory, are they taking part? Are there differences in their participation? Are they being channeled into a different pathway? And that's for your own consideration in your institutions around fitness to attend work during internships, etc., for students with disability. And no commentary there. That really, I think, but that does perhaps need something, that's an area that needs teasing out. Same approximate parity for non-workplace WIL and global WIL as we saw for all the different discipline areas. What I did do here as well, and I'm coming to you in a moment, Elizabeth, is there are differences by gender. Sorry, I just wanted to present and see if there are any differences by gender. They're very marginal, as you can see here. And actually, it's males that are participating proportionately less compared to females in work-based WIL, at least. And that's driving those differences here that you can see on the left-hand side in overall WIL. And lastly, by age, we've got big differences here, and we've always had big differences here. And I guess there's no great surprises. Our older students engage less in will, particularly in work-based will. Is that a problem? Okay, you could argue both sides. If they've got experience, is that an issue? Perhaps not. If they've got experience, but they're trying to change career, then you could argue, well, yes, it is a problem. And that's up for us to think about in our own discipline areas and whether we want to, how we want to engage with that. Key learnings here, just briefly, and that's just reiterating some of the points that have gone through. You've got rising participation amongst postgrads, but still there's room for improvement. You've got increasing engagement in any will among bachelors, but again, it's only about 40% are participating. You've got variability in will offerings in terms of participation, but particularly in work-based will when you're looking at just those areas which are traditionally elective, and recommend some discipline analysis in your own institutions. International students now engaging the same, and proportionately fewer Indigenous, low SES and students with disability taking part in work-based will. And need to identify ways to better engage mature students, or do we? Point for discussion. Okay, over to Elizabeth.
Okay, so now we're focusing on domestic bachelor students who are engaged in full-time work. Next slide, Denise. So this slide shows full-time employment. Of course, domestic only, all bachelor. There's time series for each will type. And what we can see here is that there's a positive effect of will across all the years. So having will is better for securing full-time employment than having no will experience. Work-based will is particularly effective, and global will. So next slide. And so if we break down now to looking at the differences for graduates who were students low, medium and high SES, and we look at the full-time employment, this is including all the study areas across all the survey years combined into each column. So there's 4 years of data inside each of these columns. Full-time employment by the socioeconomic status types for each will type. So especially for the low SES grads, having any will experience seems to help with securing full-time employment. And we can see that global will is also helpful for these students, for all students really, but mainly there is an improvement for the low SES cohort if they are able to go on global will. And non-work-based will is not so effective is not aligned with such good full-time employment rates for these students, but it's still better than not having any will at all. Medium socioeconomic status graduates benefit greatly from work-based will. So this type of will seems to perhaps lessen the divide between the socioeconomic statuses of graduates. And for global will, we see that the high socioeconomic status students benefit the most, which is possibly not too surprising. And I guess, you know, they're also participating more in global will. If we go to the next slide now, we'll talk about, we've got the students with disabilities. So regardless of disability, we can see from this data that we should be encouraging will for these students in our universities. And if work-based or global will is not appropriate for a particular individual, then we should construct meaningful non-work-based will experiences, because any will, as we can see in this data, is better than having no will for students with disabilities. So, and these results, they make sense to me as a person with lived experience of disability. I know that all the experiences I've had in the workplace have actually given me a lot of confidence and an ability to really understand what work is all about. So the students in your universities who have a disability, they will perhaps need more help in organising meaningful and appropriate will, but all that effort would be worth it if that is possible. So we'll go to the next slide now. This one shows with will that Indigenous graduates fared even better than without any will in terms of finding full-time employment. work-based will was the most effective type for Indigenous students, and also non-Indigenous students, but particularly the Indigenous students did quite well. It's interesting to see that non-work-based will for Indigenous graduates helped more than it did for non-Indigenous counterparts. Perhaps it's the insights into typical work tasks that is particularly helpful here. Maybe because the cultural capital is less for the Indigenous students than it is for non-Indigenous students, or they've got less exposure to it, whatever field they're working on in their community, in their families and things. So it would be interesting to explore why this might be the case by looking further into the data, and perhaps something to think about for future research. If we go into the next slide now, the full-time employment, this is the elective areas again. So this is looking at each of these pillars is combining the results for disciplines where work-based will is traditionally an elective. So these graduates, they chose to do will in their units. It wasn't mandatory. And so here we see that will still has a positive influence on full-time employment, but this depends on the type of will. Non-workplace will doesn't appear to benefit full-time employment. Perhaps it is no different in these disciplines to having a really well-designed coursework experience. Global will is the most effective, and perhaps this relates to the increased confidence that students gain by stepping out of their comfort zone to a greater extent than would normally be the case with work-based will. It's interesting to think why this all might be the case, and perhaps some areas for future research again. If we go to the next slide now, this one drills down by socioeconomic status. So we're looking at all the different types of will. We're looking at these particular elective types where people have done will in as an elective, and looking across the different socioeconomic statuses. So for the same elective disciplines, this is really interesting because the low SES students, they appear to be negatively affected by the non-workplace will in terms of securing full-time employment. So it is this cohort alone that is impacted negatively by this type of will for these elective disciplines. If you remember on the earlier slide, for all the study areas, those including those where will is typically mandatory, the effect for low socioeconomic students was slightly positive. So this is a point for further research to uncover why low SES grads in some disciplines where will is elective do not benefit at all from will, and in which disciplines in particular of the 11 are these. That would be interesting to look into. Global will, it has the best effect for the low SES students in terms of closing the gap, but again, if you remember the participation rates, low SES students are less likely to go to actually experience global will. Now, if we go to the next slide, we're looking at the same data, but this time we're not looking at low SES, but the SES statuses. We're looking at student with disability. And so non-workplace will, it doesn't seem to have a negative effect for graduates with disability. This means that perhaps we need to be providing options for students and guiding individual students towards the will type that is likely to have the best impact for them. So, for example, providing low SES students with scholarships to participate in global will and creating more innovative non-workplace will experiences for people with disabilities. So, especially if they're unlikely to be able to get the most out of participating in global or work-based will, but if there's a chance that global or work-based will support them, they're thriving, then encourage it. So it would depend on the individual student with disability as to what might be the most appropriate type of will for them. But if you find what might be the most appropriate type, then they should do really well it helping to boost their full-time employment outcomes. So these findings really just show how WIL on a case-by-case basis would be ideal, but in our underfunded sector, this is actually difficult to achieve. Now, if we go to the next one, we're looking at students who are Indigenous and non-Indigenous, comparing the two across for these elective areas again. WIL was more effective in supporting full-time employment than it was for non-Indigenous graduates. So the Indigenous graduates really benefited a lot from experiencing WIL. And so maybe WIL is perhaps a useful strategy to help close the gap in their employment outcomes, regardless of what how the WIL is experienced by them, like what type of WIL and in what discipline. But again, it would be nice to perhaps look into the different elective areas in particular and see whether there are any differences, any standout areas of Indigenous student success in achieving full-time employment. Now, we'll go to the next part of, we're going into perceived overqualification now. We're still focusing on the domestic bachelors and those that are engaged in, this time they're employed in full-time work. So they're reflecting on their perceived overqualification in that full-time work that they're experiencing. So onto the slide. This is, again, where we're not talking about the elective subjects anymore. We're back to all the disciplines. So each of these pillars, the data points includes all the disciplines. Perceived overqualification over time for each WIL type. So there's not a lot of difference across time here. And graduates who are employed and have not experienced WIL were more likely to perceive they are overqualified. And this is great news for WIL supporters, because it means that WIL, particularly work-based WIL, as you can see, it has the lowest perceived overqualification. So somehow WIL is helping graduates to find perhaps more meaningful work, or work that is better meeting their needs for the type of work experience that they need, suitably challenging and all of those kinds of things. So they're not feeling so much that they're overqualified for their jobs. On to the next slide. We're looking now at the same perceived overqualification, but we're looking at the breakdown by socioeconomic status. So for low socioeconomic status and medium SES, WIL had the most benefit in reducing perceived overqualification. Perhaps this might be due to WIL helping them to gain ground in understanding the landscape of work and careers, compared to their high SES counterparts, who likely have greater cultural and social capital. Non-workplace WIL was not as helpful for low SES grads, but it still was better than not having any WIL at all. Now we'll go to the next one. We'll be looking now at, we've got students with disability, and this data is really exciting. For graduates with disabilities, work-based WIL and global WIL, they really makes a difference in helping them to find work that matches their skill set and needs. These forms of WIL are more beneficial for those with disability than those without a disability in terms of perceived overqualification. That's another key finding. And so we'll go to the next one. Perceived overqualification. This is for Indigenous graduates versus non-Indigenous. So for the Indigenous graduates, work-based WIL had the greatest effect on reducing perceived overqualification. Global WIL helped as well, and even non-work-based WIL, but not a lot of effect on making headway with respect to closing the gap. So comparing the two columns, if you look at the differences between the columns, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, you don't see as much of an effect, a difference when we're looking at work-based WIL as as global WIL as we do with work-based WIL, even though the columns look a bit, oh no, sorry, the columns are clear. Yeah, I just can't see my little slide. But yeah, it's global will helps, and even non-work-based will, but it's not as much of effect on making headway. So Indigenous graduates, they're less likely than non-Indigenous students to feel overqualified with or without will. So it doesn't, the perceived overqualification isn't, the will isn't actually having that much of an impact on that aspect, but that might be due to their life experiences and things like that as coming into play there. Sorry, that was a bit of a tongue twister. Now we'll go to the next one. This is for the 11 elective areas. So now we're not looking at all the discipline areas, we're looking just at those 11 electives. Even though will doesn't seem to have much effect on the full-time employment rate for the disciplines where will is typically an elective, it does seem to influence the graduate's perceived overqualification and for the better. So it seems beneficial for graduates, for students to encounter elective will regardless of their discipline if we think about perceived overqualification in isolation of other factors. And again, more nuanced investigation into these elective areas would be helpful to fully understand what's going on here, because it's hard to really tell which of the electives are really working in respect to this, but yeah, you can see that there isn't too much effect for disciplines where will is typically an effective elective. If we go to the next one, we're looking at socioeconomic status. So for low SES grads who experience elective will, non-work-based will had little effect on perceived overqualification. Work-based will and global will were helpful. Will of any type helps the medium SES graduates the most in terms of addressing perceived overqualification. Now, if we go to the next slide, we're back with students with disability. Graduates with disabilities who experience elective will in any form were less likely to feel overqualified. So that's another very good finding. And there was a particularly pronounced influence of global will. So if we can actually organise global will experience for a student with disability, and we are fairly sure they're going to thrive in that, they are going to benefit in terms of finding more meaningful work that is going to benefit their employment into the future. So if we go to the next slide with Indigenous students, Indigenous graduates who experienced elective will, particularly global will, they were less likely to feel overqualified. And so that's a really interesting finding. I guess for the students that we've been looking at, these different equity groups, if we can provide them with these global will experiences, then it can be really beneficial. And maybe that's something we could think about with scholarships and things like that, or just helping students with participate and then experience these really exciting opportunities in the will space. So that's all from me. We're going back to Denise again.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, so looking at perceived preparedness, so this is graduates reflecting back on how well they felt their course prepared them for the full-time role that they're currently working in. So just recognising this is the whole course, so we can't attribute any fantastic results entirely, obviously, to will. It's how the whole course prepared them. So we're looking at nuances or differences between those that did will and those that didn't. This does include international students as well. Unlike the full-time employment data and the perceived overqualification in line with the Social Research Centre reporting, which is only for domestic, this is for both. So if you have a look at this slide, you can see the will type on the left, the years on the left. The dark green there is those that felt that they were well or very well prepared for their full-time work that they're currently in, and the grey being those that felt that they weren't prepared at all, not well prepared, or they weren't sure in their answer. The thing that I think is quite striking across the board, and if you're across your own GOS data, I'm sure you'll have heard this already, is that when we look, irrespective of the category, the group, when we look at these percentage figures over time, they've declined. So essentially we can see here that preparedness for full-time work, or for those in full-time roles, has declined over the 4 years. You know, that's something for us to consider for our own institutions. Could it be because of, you know, are our courses fit for purpose in relation to, you know, developing our graduates for contemporary work and work practices? That's a question for us in our different discipline areas when you drill down into your data. But focusing in on WIL itself. So while there's been that decline in preparedness, WIL has buffered that slightly, although, you know, not entirely. You can still see dropping there. But essentially, there are quite big gaps there between those that engaged in any WIL and those that didn't participate in any WIL at all. I mean, you can see there broadly, you've got early 80s and then you've got late, you know, mid to late 60s. So there's quite a big percentage difference in terms of there are proportionately more graduates that felt that they were very well prepared, and that's really if they did any type of WIL. Where are those differences being driven from? Actually, the results are positive for all types of WIL, but particularly work-based and particularly global WIL. But non-workplace WIL is up there as well. And we have discussed this previously in earlier webinars about the employment effects, or sometimes lack of, for non-workplace WIL, but not forgetting, you know, the value of non-workplace WIL for developing skills. And that might be where we can see its positive results around preparedness, rather than perhaps around full-time employment outcomes and also around perceived overqualification. In terms of the elective areas, so the slide previously was for all course areas. Again, you can see that decline. I mean, that's the same for the elective areas, that general decline over time. And yes, you can see that the WIL effect, there is a WIL effect there, and it's, you know, it's positive. Otherwise, you've got the same trends. Really, you've got the WIL effect for all types, but more so for work-based and global. And you've got the premium from WIL is gaining traction over time, and that was the same for all of the discipline areas as well. Okay, so in terms of key learnings, impact, and then we'll move to any questions that we've got there in the chat. So key learnings in terms of full-time employment, those graduates who participated in WIL, particularly work-based, had higher rates of full-time employment. Most significant in the positive impact, interestingly, was most significant in disciplines where work-based WIL is traditionally mandatory. And that's me looking at the differences between doing a particular type of WIL, in that case it's work-based WIL, and not doing any WIL, and looking at the differences between those percentage points. The premium for WIL has not changed much over the years. It's there, which is great. But it's not particularly, you know, it's not growing and it's not retracting over time. And of the reported equity groups, obviously we haven't covered them all, the greatest gains from work-based WIL were among students with disability. In terms of perceived overqualification, so those, that's, you know, graduate perception, as Elizabeth said, on whether they feel that they're in work that's aligned to their degree study and they're utilising their skills from their degree education. Participation WIL consistently across the board reduces the likelihood of graduates perceiving themselves as overqualified. We do recommend some discipline-based analysis because there were some differences between the elective and the all-discipline area, which you'll only understand if you look at your own institution's data. To be honest, when I looked at the data and I compared the percentages between those that did work-based WIL and those that didn't do any type of WIL, and I compared those differences across the groups, like Indigenous and non-Indigenous, for example, and low SES and those, you know, more high SES, I might have expected, in line with the literature, relatively greater gains. I didn't see that come through very overtly. Someone's asked a question about, can you have a copy of the slides? Yes, you can, and there is a recording. So we'll make sure the slides we might not post on the website, that they will be going out. We can find a way of circulating those to those that registered. But the recording does, from my understanding, goes onto the website itself. In terms of perceived preparedness, general decline over the 4 years, there is a positive impact from WIL, and that's increased over the 4 years, although not entirely buffered that decline. And there's a positive effect from all types of WIL, but particularly work-based and global experiences. So that is it in terms of questions. Sorry, I don't know where my Q&A slide's gone, but it's disappeared. Over to questions. So I think I'm just going to whiz straight into the chat because we have 10 minutes. And I am going to go here. Is it possible to get GOS data on perceived qualification by union field? You have your own institution's data, and hopefully you're using it and analysing it. We can't break down the national data under the agreement that we have under the Universities Australia data sharing agreement. We don't have the breakdown by university. We can't see graduate detail, we can't see institution details. So the answer to that is no, but you obviously have your own institution's data that you can work with and do, and hopefully follow along with some of you'll have this as benchmarks, which is hopefully helpful. Jen, you've asked about comments on differences in numbers of respondents. Sorry, I can't recall that in terms of group sizes offhand. But the group sizes you'll be able to see from the 3-year review, they weren't varied much since then. You'll see that in the brief sheet that we did for participation and impact. The sample sizes are in there, so you'll be able to glean it from there, and also from the annual membership, from the annual summary report that we release. Is it all unpaid will that we're looking at? Jen has asked. We don't differentiate between paid and unpaid. We're focused on those 3 different types of will, whether it's non-workplace, work-based, or global. We don't differentiate other than that. So in terms of participation and impact, we can't break down to that level. You might be able to in your own institutions, depending on how you classify will in your own areas. You might possibly be able to track back and look at your own data and see if you can separate that out. What about any insights on combinations of forms of will? When graduates did non-workplace, work-based, haven't looked at that, Jen. We have looked at combinations. We've looked at, and there's actually a paper that's been released on that. You can find it in Google Scholar if you're interested in looking at it. Just drop me an email. That has looked at those that engage in paid employment during their study and work-based will and the relative impact of those. So if they didn't work at all, but they just did work-based will, or if they did work-based will and they did paid employment. So we have looked at nuances around that. Have you looked at registration to an organisation in order to have the work? Sorry, Janice, that's probably me. I'm not quite sure what you mean. Have you looked at registration? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that question. I don't know if you want to just reword it slightly, sorry, and dump it into the chat. Happy to look at that. Okay, Heather's pasted some other questions.
All the same, Denise.
All the same, okay. So Janice, sorry, that might be me being a bit thick. If you want to just drop your question in there, because unless Elizabeth wants to answer that one. Okay. Okay. Any other questions at all? We have a few minutes left. If you want to pop any others into the chat. Or any comments otherwise on areas that would be particularly useful for you to look at. I'm hoping that these slides will provide you with some benchmarking data, and I'm really hoping that within your institutions you're drilling down and doing analysis at this kind of level. We do it in our own institution and it's really insightful. I obviously, understandably, your sample sizes are going to be smaller, and once you start going down to discipline level and even to course or program, degree, qualification level, depending on what terminology you use, the sample sizes are smaller, so you need to treat it with caution, especially if you start looking at nuances by group. So yeah, so just obviously be mindful of that. Matty, good that Will is still positive, but with the overall decline since 2000, how much do we attribute to COVID, and how much can we consider the issue of students completing part-time work? I think there's another factor in there as well, and I'm surprised that we don't see it with the international students, and that's the linking to the work cap. Very interesting that that's still rising when you've got this hideous, I don't know how you're going in your own institution, but we're seeing international students withdrawing from optional work-based will because of cost of living, needing to work, and their hours, because it's elective will in our area, counting towards their work cap. I do think the global will figures are impacted by the COVID restrictions, certainly, and then we haven't kind of recovered from that. It would be interesting, I guess, on that question, Matty, it'd be interesting to know if there hadn't been COVID, where our work-based will stats would be sitting. My personal view is that I would have expected a bigger, noted a bigger growth in the last year or two. But yeah, maybe we're still seeing that lag from COVID and the work-based restrictions. So maybe we'll see that more in the years to come. Okay, I can't see any other questions, unless anyone has any other comments. An area that we're keen to focus on is the postgrads. Like I said, postgrad coursework, I think it needs a bit of, we tend to focus on the bachelors, so that's an area that we will provide some more data on going forward. And the HDRs, certainly, I think, you know, give it another year or so we can really kind of see hopefully the positive impacts from the MPIL funding. Bit of a shame that it won't be continuing in its current form. But yes, hopefully we might see, unless I've got there's some news on that I don't know. It will be interesting to see what the impact of that has been. Okay, we have 4 minutes to spare. So there are some other events coming up, which if you go to the events link on the ACEN website, you'll be able to see there's a raft of different events going on in the next few weeks. If you have any questions around the items and accessing the data, then please just send them through to the central admin address and we can go through those. And if you've got any burning questions from this, then please flick them through to the central email and Laura can pass them on to me and to myself and Elizabeth if needed. Otherwise, we'll let you know how the slides will come out to you. The recording will go onto the website. The slides will be separate from that. Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks for joining us, and see you all soon.